Now let us turn to the true birthplace of the North, which is the second Massachusetts colony, the colony known as Massachusetts Bay. Massachusetts Bay emerged just to the north of Plymouth, and the people who settled this colony were Puritans. That is, they were religious reformers who wanted to purify the Anglican Church. Whereas the Pilgrims simply wanted to get away from the church, these Puritans wanted to retain the state church, but they wanted to change it. Now, the Puritans began arriving in large numbers in 1630 when 200 ships carrying about 700 settlers and led by a man named John Winthrop landed at what would be Boston today. And this was the beginning of what we call the Puritans' Great Migration. Between 1630 and 1640, about 20,000 Puritans arrived in the Boston area and began spreading out and colonizing what would be Massachusetts today. Now, this Great Migration was actually a huge event. It actually involved about 80,000 people coming from towns all over Britain and headed to a variety of places. Some came to New England, but others went to Ireland and the Caribbean, and again, about 20,000 of these people came here to North America. Now, what was going on? Why were so many Puritans leaving Britain? Well, one of the major reasons was the man pictured here. King Charles I drove a lot of them away. Now, understand that by the early 1600s, there was a fair amount of dissatisfaction with the Anglican Church. A lot of Englishmen were becoming Puritans, that is, people who wanted to retain the state church but wanted to fix it, wanted to alter elements of it, and Puritans came in a variety of shapes and sizes. There were various things they didn't like about the Anglican Church. They said it was apathetic, corrupt, had too much power, was prone to elitism, and there were even doctrinal issues as well. We saw these same complaints with the Separatists, and Puritans voiced a lot of the same problems. By about 1620, there were so many people calling themselves Puritans that they actually had a fairly sizable membership in Parliament. Now, Charles I was an interesting king in that he actually believed in the divine right of kings. He believed that his rule was the law, and since the Anglican Church was his church, he didn't like people telling him that it had to change. So, under his belief that he was divinely chosen to rule, he actually started behaving dictatorially. He started shutting down the Parliament when the Puritans in there did things he didn't like. And he actually dissolved the British Parliament permanently in 1629. He was also involved in removing Puritans from government positions, which was depriving them of their incomes, and so Puritans began to believe that leaving England was their only chance at recovering their incomes and starting again. So a lot of them began to leave, and this was called the Great Migration. A good question to ask at this point would be who was paying for all this migration, and the Puritans had joint stock companies. In fact, the ones who were coming to Massachusetts Bay had behind them a joint stock company called the Massachusetts Bay Company. Now here's a little bit about Puritan finance. The Massachusetts Bay Company, for instance, had far more resources than the merchant adventurers who funded the little Pilgrim migration. The Pilgrim migration was very small. The Puritans were going to bring thousands and thousands of people to the New World. And many Puritans were middle class or above, in fact. In fact, one of the original founders of the Massachusetts Bay Company was the son of the Lord Mayor of London. And others actually started out as Anglican ministers, college graduates, educated people of note. So when the Pilgrims came to settle in when the Puritans came to settle in North America, a lot of these travelers were paying their own way. And it's also interesting that they brought the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Company to Massachusetts with them when they crossed the Atlantic. And what that meant was that these Puritans did not intend to be under the control of anyone back in Britain. No church, no merchants, not anyone. If you read into this financial information, it'll tell you a lot about these Puritans. The fact that they were paying their own way, that they brought their company charter with them, shows that these were driven, aggressive, motivated people, and they were. they also had a goal that was very different from that of the Pilgrims. Where the Pilgrims simply wanted to separate from the Anglican Church and be left alone, the Puritans didn't want to do that. The Puritans very much wanted to maintain the state religion. What they wanted to do was purify it, to eliminate the corruption in the church, the apathy, and these particular Puritans wanted to change the very nature of the faith itself to reflect their Puritan beliefs. Now, what were those beliefs? Well, the Puritans were Calvinistic, Congregational, and Presbyterian. And what that means is they wanted a new, more egalitarian theology in place. They wanted their congregations to be run individually, and they wanted their congregations to be guided by elected elders. In other words, they wanted a more egalitarian religion that was run individually, not something that was conducted from a massive non-democratic bureaucracy like you found in the Anglican Church. So, religion is going to be at the heart of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Thus, if you're going to understand the behavior of this colony, you're going to have to understand the belief system that they followed. So we're now going to do a discussion of Calvinism, because the Puritans were Calvinists. Now, Calvinism is one of the most important religions to come out of the Protestant Reformation. It's named for a man named John Calvin, who lived between 1509 and 1564. Now, Calvin was born in France, and his father worked as a notary for the Catholic Church, so he made a fairly good living. He made enough money that he was able to send John Calvin to a university, and he got an education. And some say that his university training taught him to think outside the box. I mean, this was in the Renaissance. And what we know is that though John Calvin was raised Catholic, he suddenly converted to Protestantism sometime between 1528 and 1533. He said he found the Catholic Church unsatisfactory, and what he wanted was a more intimate association with Christ, a more individual interaction with Christ than that church could provide. Now, he began studying the Bible, and as he did so, he developed a new theology that he thought would connect God and man and Christ and man and eliminate some of the abuses on top of that and some of the corruption that he saw in Catholicism. Now, from his reading of the Bible, he came to these conclusions, and these 4 things are the basis of Calvinism. 1, he said, man was totally depraved, that man was appalling, depraved, could not be saved through his own actions. Number 2, he said God was incomprehensible to man, that God would do things periodically that man simply could not understand, and that was it. But he said God, for some reason, was also merciful to this depraved creature of man and provided man with a beautiful world to enjoy and food to enjoy and beer to drink and hikes to go on and beautiful nature and love and such. And because God was merciful, he also did this, and this is number 4. He also provided salvation, that is, a trip to heaven, for a lucky few souls who were chosen before they were even born. And that's the concept of predestination, which is hugely important in Calvinism. Now, who were the chosen ones? Well, no one ever knew completely. According to Calvin, that was part of it. You never really knew. So it was best to live your life as if, you had a chance. Calvin said there were a few hints that God was known to approve of thrift, ambition, and hard work, so he said that people with those traits were likely going to heaven, but again, you never really knew. So, the human depravity, incomprehensible God, merciful God, and predestination are the 4 main beliefs of Calvinism. Now, why is it important to understand Calvinism? It's because of the implications of this religion, which are enormous and actually altered Western Civ. You think about what Calvin was saying. In his belief system, God was all-important and all-powerful. God controlled the destiny of all mankind, which meant God became more important than nation, country, or king. And there's something else going on here as well. In Calvin's ideas, or in Calvin's beliefs, all men were the same in the eyes of God. We were all depraved, all equally depraved. So there were no special divinely ordained kings, no elites, no nobles who could stand there and say, well, I'm better than you. Everybody's exactly the same in the eyes of God, and God is the only being that matters. So what scholars have said about Calvinism is it's humanistic in nature. It emphasizes the sameness of humanity in the eyes of God and has less emphasis placed on race or class or even sex. It also encourages human invention, the appreciation of beauty, the concept of love for all people. So this belief system would take mankind in Western Civ in entirely new directions, in directions where class, race, sex had less importance than they had before. It emphasized love for all humans, the equality of all humans. And it's kind of interesting because there's a paradox there. Calvin himself was actually very harsh on anyone who didn't believe in Calvinism. He was not a big believer in religious toleration, so there's kind of a paradox there that this man who created this humanistic belief system was himself not very humanistic. But anyway, by the time the Puritans started to emerge in Britain in the 1600s, they had modified Calvinism into something new that they called covenant theology. Now, you can do this with Protestant faiths because there's no pope, no college of cardinals to keep the faith in line. Protestantism can be altered. So what the Puritans did was they slightly altered some of the Calvinist doctrine to make it easier for people to understand and to follow. They kept the idea that man was depraved. They kept the idea that God was unknowable. They kept the idea that God was also merciful. And they agreed that, yes, God had chosen some people for heaven before they were born, chose some souls. But they added to that the idea that God also offered everyone a chance to earn salvation as well. God offered you certain terms, like a contract, which the Puritans called a covenant, hence covenant theology. The terms were that if you wanted to earn salvation, you had to achieve utter faith in God and in his powers and love. And utter faith is more than just saying, I have faith in God or I believe in God. Utter faith is on a whole nother level. It was similar to having kind of an out-of-body experience once you had achieved utter faith in God. And once this experience had happened, it was said you'd achieved the faith and salvation was granted. Now, because of this need for people to achieve utter faith if they wanted to go to heaven, religion became an enormous part of Puritan society. And because achieving utter faith was an intellectual exercise, it was something you had to think yourself into, in Puritan culture, sermons and speeches and religious teachings and Bible study were highly valued. I mean, many people have heard the old stories that Puritans went and heard sermons that lasted for hours and hours. That's true. That's what they wanted, because you never knew when a part of a sermon could trigger the total faith in God that you were trying to get. So going to church for long hours and listening on Sunday and then going to Bible study afterwards and reading the Bible and thinking about the Bible and focusing on religion, that was something they wanted to do. This religion, this covenant theology, was intellectual. It involved learning and scholarship, and it resulted in a strong emphasis on education in Puritan society. The first college in America was Harvard, after all, which was opened in Massachusetts in 1640. Now let's go back to this notion of utter faith for just a moment. How did someone know if they had achieved utter faith in God, or if they were just having a really joyful moment or something? How did you know the difference? You didn't really know until you died, to be quite honest. Even in covenant theology, you still were never sure if your experience was truly the experience of utter faith. But the Puritans did say that there were certain telltale signs that meant that you had achieved utter faith. People reported falling down, being filled with the presence of God, floating above their bodies, writhing, having seizures. It was a very powerful experience. And what Puritan churches would have you do is, if you had one of these experiences, like you were reading the Bible and suddenly you were overcome by the presence of God and you fell on the floor, what you would do is go to your church elders, because remember, Puritans not only wanted to be Calvinists, they also wanted each church to be run individually by its own set of elders. So you would go to your church elders, tell them what had happened to you, explain it in detail, and they would test you and say, well, did you see this or this? And some of their questions were tricks to see if you were just going to answer yes to everything they said. If you successfully passed their test, they said that you indeed had a conversion experience. You had achieved utter faith in God. And if you achieved utter faith in God, you got a new status in the church. You were then called one of the elect, or a visible saint, and you got new privileges in the church. If you were a man, you now had a say over what the church did. Puritan churches were congregational, meaning they were run by their congregations that were overseen by elected elders. So if you were elect, you got to be part of the process. Now, there were other ways, too, that you could become elect. Calvin said that certain characteristics, a life of good works, thrift, or hard work, or success in business, these were all signs of God's pleasure. So people who had these habits, even if they never had a conversion experience, they could also be considered elect as well. Now, clearly, the Puritan faith was rather complicated. It was an intellectual religion, as I've said, required a great deal of thinking, a great deal of concerning yourself with the Bible and with God. It had to have churches and ministers and Bible study groups. This was a complex religion. And the complexity is part of the reason the Puritans came to the American colonies. When they left Britain, the Puritans were under attack from the king. What they wanted to do in America was make a model world based on covenant theology. This model world, they said, would remove the Puritans from the distractions in Britain, remove them from all the things that were going on in there, and let them focus completely on their faith. And they believed that in this world, far away from Britain, all of their members had a chance to develop their faith and ultimately achieve a conversion experience and become elect. They thought they could do this 100%. And they said if this happened, if they got 100% of their people into utter faith in God, a miracle would occur. And then the world, meaning Britain and Europe, would see the great glories of a society based on Puritan belief. The Puritans truly hoped that the rest of the world would watch what they were doing. In fact, John Winthrop, who led the first fleet of ships to America in 1630, said, in his most famous quote, "We shall be as a city on a hill. The eyes of the world are upon us." They were really hoping that everybody was watching this great Puritan experiment. And they were hoping that as the world watched them, they would see that there was nothing to fear if you switched to the Puritan faith. There was nothing scary about it, nothing terrible. You wouldn't go to hell. Now, because of the nature of this mission, the Puritans also actually didn't plan on spending the rest of their lives in America. They had hoped that they could come over here, they would achieve utter faith fairly quickly, the miracle would happen, and then they would sail back to Britain, bringing this positive message that the Puritan faith was okay and safe and brought a miracle, and they would go back home and be hailed as heroes. So John Winthrop said when he got here that they were on an errand into the wilderness, an errand that they intended to return from. So think about what we're dealing with in this colony. These weren't Virginia tobacco people who were just over here to make money and be greedy and brutal and whatever. These were crusaders. These people were on a mission to achieve what no other group on earth had ever achieved before. An achievement they thought would be so great God himself would notice and cause a miracle itself so great that when the Puritans sailed back to Britain, everybody would become a Puritan and the Anglican Church would be instantly purified. This is a massive undertaking, and it's a very aggressive undertaking as well. So when we look at these people coming over, this is their mindset. These aren't just average people. So think of a great migration of tens of thousands of people coming over here with this same mindset. They came from towns and cities across Britain. They settled and moved in groups because the town was critical to this mission. The town is where the church would be. It was where the people would gather to help each other to achieve utter faith. So this kind of crusading mentality would infect all of Massachusetts Bay society. The first thing you notice about Massachusetts Bay is that it was extremely town-oriented. In the first 10 years of this colony's existence, they built 24 towns. In the totality of the 1600s, they built 133 towns. In the towns, there were regular town meetings. People were encouraged to speak up, to voice any kinds of problems that were going on, get them out in the open so we could fix them. People were encouraged to participate. And in the towns, you were also supposed to watch each other to make sure no one was violating the rules defined by Calvinism. There was to be no adultery, no sacrilege, no cruelty, no blood sports, no envy, no gossip. The towns were also to ensure that people's behavior was following what Calvin said it should. God liked industry and hard work. So, in the towns, you were supposed to watch your neighbors and make sure people were keeping their houses neat and ordered and putting up fences and developing technology and also caring for each other and taking care of the sick and visiting and taking care of the poor. People were to obey God's laws, and the towns were critical to that obedience. Now, how far down into the culture did religion go? Well, about as far down as tobacco got into Virginia culture. So let's run a cultural study of Massachusetts Bay, just like we did in Virginia. Take a look at sex, which in Virginia was a competitive sports. In Calvinistic Massachusetts Bay, sex was one of the things that God gave humankind out of his great mercy. So sex was not something they were squeamish about. They said it was a loving activity to be shared between a husband and wife, but only between a husband and wife. It wasn't a competitive sport, it was a shared behavior. And similarly, women were actually respected in this colony. Because if you think about it, Calvinism said that anybody could be chosen to go to heaven. It didn't matter if you were a man or a woman. Humans were all equally depraved in the eyes of God, so male and female mattered less in this colony, which doesn't mean that women were always equal to men, because they weren't, but they were respected. Many times women led Bible study groups. Many times women were consulted in the towns for what should we do? How should we handle this problem? It was often elder females people went to. Again, because women were respected equally in the Calvinistic world. Now, in terms of naming children, we saw that Virginia named their kids after power and strength and nobles. Massachusetts favored Bible names, as you'd expect. So think of our famous people from Massachusetts: John Adams, Paul Revere, Samuel Adams. And girls, you have a lot of Annes and Deborahs and Ruths, again from the Bible. In terms of education, this was a highly educated colony because you couldn't become elect if you weren't reading the Bible. And becoming elect was critical to this colony's experience. So, in 1647, Massachusetts Bay passed a law that all towns had to have a school for the teaching of girls and boys. Now, in terms of sports, Massachusetts Bay colonists would not engage in cruelty. That was against God's laws. So there were no blood sports, no torturing animals, no fighting, no boxing and wrestling and such as you saw in Virginia, no horse racing. Instead, Massachusetts Bay colonists played town-oriented games. They played games together. Soccer, various group activities. They liked to go hiking, which is a very Calvinistic thing to do. They also played the game that you see here, which is town ball, or town game, which is apparently an old peasant game that came over from Europe, which looks like modern baseball but isn't. Some believe that modern baseball actually evolved out of this game. Town ball or town game has a pitcher and a batter and 4 bases in a diamond, and the pitcher pitches and the batter hits, but then it doesn't have teams, and it's a little bit more like cricket. But again, modern baseball, it's believed, evolved out of this game. But you notice how the game is played. Everyone shares the field. We play together. We're not antagonistic with each other. You're just running around the bases and having fun. So, Let's compare Massachusetts Bay with Virginia, because these are going to be the founding areas of our North and our South for the Civil War. So if you were to compare these two colonies together, you'd say which one would win the Civil War? In Virginia, everything was competitive, from clothing to how many children you had to how many slaves and how much tobacco you had. And in Massachusetts Bay, everything was kind of equality-oriented. There was almost no competition. Virginians even ranked people on clothing. Massachusetts Bay Colony really didn't care what you wore. The idea that Puritans always wore black is wrong. They didn't. They loved all kinds of different colors. It really didn't matter. Now, Virginia was rural. Massachusetts Bay was more urban. Virginia was unequal. Massachusetts Bay believed that all were equal in the eyes of God. Virginia was brutal towards its people, competitive and brutal and enslaving people. Massachusetts Bay was more kind, except in regards to religious toleration, because this is not a colony that practiced religious toleration. But at any rate, towards each other, the Puritans were kind and generous. They were urged to care for each other, share with each other, visit the sick, take care of them, work in groups together to help people. See, Virginia liked violent sports. Massachusetts liked group-oriented activities. Virginia didn't care about education. The idea was, if I can read and you can't, I win. Massachusetts Bay insisted on education for everyone. Virginia was individualistic, man against the wilderness. And Massachusetts Bay liked people together in towns and churches. So, if you look at these two together, side by side, who would you think would win the war? The brutal, violent, blood sport-loving Virginians who are out there fighting and competing from the day they're born, or the town-living, book-reading, Bible-loving Massachusettsans who are caring for each other and focusing on their schools and their book learning and such? Who would you think would win the war? I mean, if you're like most people, you'd put your money on Virginia, wouldn't you? The more competitive, more violent culture. That's what most people think, or would think, and that's in fact what Virginia thought in the Civil War. The problem is that the culture that grows out of Massachusetts Bay is not only going to win the Civil War, it's going to annihilate the culture that comes out of Virginia, which is not what you'd expect. But if you start looking at Massachusetts Bay society and culture, you find out why. You find out there's something very dark lurking in this colony. Despite its emphasis on love and compassion and caring and enjoying God's world, there's also an extremely intense edge here. For one thing, Puritans believed in state church. They are not interested in freedom of religion whatsoever. They believed there had to be a state church. They want to purify the state church, not do away with it. Therefore, you find this harsh edge showing up first in their treatment of dissenters and heretics. If you were not a Puritan, you could expect to be banned from any of their colonies because you're screwing up their mission. If you kept coming back, as some Quakers would do, the punishments would get more severe, including up to the level of death, and that was in keeping with what Calvin himself advocated. There was no dissent allowed in Massachusetts Bay, no dissent whatsoever, again, to the point of execution. But think about this as well. Think about the nature of the Puritan mission, and you'll start to see how very dark this colony could get. Their mission was to serve God and make a perfect world according to God's laws and achieve utter faith in God. That meant that anything that was a threat to what God loved, or anything evil that would get in the way of what God loved or would prevent you from appreciating God, would have to be eliminated completely. Even minor things like gossip had to be destroyed. Gossips had to be publicly humiliated, taken out, made so that they would never ever do that again. Adultery had to be punished as well, because that's one of the big laws in the Ten Commandments. So adultery, again, if you kept doing it, could be punished by death. Talking back to parents is also another big one. On the Puritan legal books, that particular problem, childhood delinquency, could be punished by death. In other words, if something threatened one of God's laws or something that God loved, the Puritans would kill to eliminate the threat. In simple terms, what we find in Massachusetts Bay is that anything this colony identified as a threat to their mission, to God, a threat to anything God loved or decreed, would be utterly and completely destroyed, again, to the point of death. Now, how do we know that they actually did this? Well, they tell us. They tell us flat out that that's what they believe. And they tell us through the witchcraft incidents of the late 1600s. And boy, these witchcraft incidents make Virginia look pretty tame. Now, witchcraft is something everyone knows about in regards to Massachusetts Bay Colony, but it's a little bit more complicated and more sinister than most people realize. Now, witchcraft began appearing in the Massachusetts Bay Colony right around 1675. In fact, it showed up for the first time right after a particularly terrible Indian War. Now, what were witches? Well, witches were people who had done something that was just absolutely appalling in the eyes of Puritan colonists. A witch was somebody who was colluding with the devil, either a man or a woman, it didn't matter. Puritans were trained to believe that the devil was always there, that obviously if you're serving God and trying to make God's perfect world, well, that goes against the interests of the devil. So you were told to look out, that he was present, that he wanted to mess up this mission, and you were always supposed to be on the lookout for him. Now, what a witch did, a witch is someone who gave in to the devil's entreaties or trickery or whatever and began using the devil's power to hurt people. And what witches did is they hurt people in ways that took their minds off the mission, which means they went after your children, your farm animals, your crops, things that would make you go, oh, all I can focus on is my poor child who's having a problem. You're no longer thinking about achieving utter faith in God. Witches could pit neighbor against neighbor, family against family, brother against brother. And Massachusetts Bay, after 1675, began to have an enormous amount of witchcraft. There were, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, 234 charges of witchcraft and 36 executions, which are extremely high numbers even in the context of Britain overall. Britain did have a tradition of witchcraft, but these Massachusetts Bay numbers are enormous even by British standards. Now, the very worst event in the witchcraft era came in a town called Salem. It happened in 1691, 1692, and most everyone has heard of the Salem witchcraft incident. There's about 100 books written on this thing. It's a very well-studied event. What happened in Salem, very simple, is this. This town went a little crazy. A little crazy is an understatement. This town went mad. Between the winter of 1691 and the summer of 1692, over 100 people were accused of witchcraft in this town. And it actually started in December of 1691 when some children, ages 7 to about 13, were bored in the winter. They were girls. And they were playing together and they were bored. And they asked a local slave from the Caribbean for games to play and such, and she taught them black magic, which I'm assuming she did partly for revenge. Massachusetts Bay had slavery, not a lot. Most of their slaves were picked up in trade with the Caribbean. But there was a slave living in the local minister's household, and it was this slave who taught his daughter some black magic. It was relatively minor stuff, and it probably seemed kind of exciting to these girls at first, but she taught them how to crack an egg and read the yolk to see what their future husband might be, which strikes me as kind of a boring game because it seems like most everybody's going to marry a farmer, so you're going to waste a lot of eggs proving that you're going to marry a farmer, but at any rate. All right, the girls were cracking eggs and looking at the yolks and reading the signs until one of the yolks formed the shape of a coffin, which they interpreted to mean that they were now speaking directly to the devil, which for little Puritan children raised with the notion of the devil and the concept of hell, which is really bad in Puritan religion, that was terrifying to them, and they had no place to go. They couldn't tell their parents what they'd been doing. I mean, one of the fathers was the local minister, so they couldn't explain, yeah, we were playing with black magic and we brought the devil into the house. So they started having, fits and crying and hiding under tables and biting themselves. They were terrified. Now, a couple of years earlier, Boston nearby had had a big witchcraft scare, and a couple of witches had been executed. It was children having fits that had started that witchcraft scare, and everybody was still talking about it. So when these kids started crawling under tables and hiding and biting themselves and crying and acting terrified, the parents jumped to the conclusion that it was another witchcraft incident. So they asked them, "Who did this to you? Who's the witch?" And they started naming townspeople. It seems like the girls actually started to believe that they were bewitched to do these activities, and they started naming people in Salem as the witches. They named a whole bunch of people. They named over 100 individuals, as I said, including elderly grandmothers. They named a couple people who were elect. They named local businessmen. They named anybody they could think of. They named the young and the old. One of the people who got convicted of witchcraft was 4 years old. Now here's a picture of the city of Salem with the gallows hill behind this Walgreen where the witches were hung. And Salem has made a fair amount of money off tourist dollars in recent years, promoting itself as this city of witches. As a historian, I really don't agree with that. The Salem witchcraft incident isn't funny. It's not cute or quaint or anything. 20 people were murdered in this town in really cold blood. You see that hill behind the Walgreens here? That's where they did it. What they would do to the people who were accused is they'd bring them into the church or various homes, actually, and subject them to just a terrifying examination. They were stripped and searched for signs of witchcraft on their bodies, because witches were supposed to have certain skin signs. If you found them, you could prove that this person was a witch. They were stripped and then they were examined, which means they were asked questions like, "Why do you torment these girls?" And if you said, "Well, I don't," they would hit you with, "No, not you physically. It's your specter that the devil has given you. The invisible you that runs out and tortures people and then comes back that you can't see or control. Why is your specter doing this?" And if you'd say, "Well, I'm not aware that it is. I'm not doing that." Well, the girls would scream and cry and claim that, "I see the specter sitting next to me. She chokes me. She bites me." And what are you supposed to do? So the people who were murdered were actually the best people of town. They were people who said, "I'm not doing this." They refused to confess, refused to plead guilty. And if you wouldn't plead guilty, the punishment was execution. So picture on that hill behind this Walgreens, 20 people were taken up there, and they were hung in the most horrible way possible. They slow hung them, which means that instead of dropping them sharply to snap the neck, they had them step off the side of a ladder and swing so that they choked to death, and their eyes and their noses and their tongues bled. Some of these people were grandmothers. Some of them were mothers of children. Some of them were businessmen. One of them was a Puritan minister. And as they swung and bled and choked out their lives, the Puritans of Salem stood around and laughed and jeered. One very elderly man in his 80s refused to answer any questions. So up there on Gallows Hill, the Puritans piled rocks on his chest until his ribs snapped like gunshots, and his tongue jammed out of his mouth under the pressure, and he died. So this isn't a funny event. It's not a cute event. It's a mass murder, which again makes Virginia look pretty tame. In its wildest moments, Virginia does not slow hang grandmothers. Now, why is this happening? I mean, what in the world would be going on in Massachusetts to cause 20 people to be murdered in Salem, 2 in Boston, 36 in total? What's going on? And the answer is that it's a decline in the mission. This started happening after 1675. The errand into the wilderness isn't working. You've been here longer than you supposed you would be. Where's the miracle? Where's the 100% faith in God? What Puritans started noticing is that the younger generation, they were no longer interested in the mission. America was their home, not Britain. They didn't want to go back. They didn't care about making God's perfect world. They had opportunities here they'd never have at home. So conversion experiences were dropping, and people were starting to notice more average traits like greed and materialism, and squabbling was starting to become more common. The conclusion drawn by the church-going members of the Puritan faith was that something terrible was at work in the colony, that the mission wasn't going on, it wasn't happening. Tensions were rising, church membership was declining, conversion experiences were falling. evil had infected Massachusetts Bay. And they thought about who would put evil into Massachusetts, who would want this mission to fail, and they concluded, obviously, well, the devil, obviously. The devil must be at work. So once they concluded the devil was at work, they were ripe for hunting for witches, for finding the people who were channeling the devil's power and causing problems in the colony. So any bad event, a failed crop, an illness, an injury, that was taken as a sign of the devil's work, the devil working through witches. And people started getting accused. About 80% of the accused were women. Some of the witches, though, around Massachusetts Bay were people who were threatening tradition by becoming more commercial and less interested in the old mission. In some cases, the witches were women who seemed to be getting wealthy and independent and were challenging the social order. Now, my point is not to get into a detailed analysis of witchcraft in Massachusetts and New England. If you're interested in the subject, there are actually hundreds of books written on it, and some of them are actually really interesting. My point is actually to analyze what witchcraft is telling us about Massachusetts Bay culture and Northern culture by proxy. Now, what witchcraft tells us is that Massachusetts Bay gets incredibly violent if it perceives a threat to something God loves. So it perceives itself as a culture that God appreciates and God likes. If something begins to threaten that culture, they go after it hard and end up killing people. What witchcraft is telling us is that threats to things that God loves are associated with the devil in Massachusetts, and the devil deserves no mercy. The devil can be killed. Now, or the devil's minions can be killed, so to speak. Now, we know that religion deeply, deeply influenced this colony, so they tend to see the world around them in religious terms. So we have to assume, and we can assume, that Massachusetts is going to see God's love in other things as well. So what if they perceive America and the culture that they're building over here as divinely sanctioned, as so successful that it must obviously be a reflection of God's appreciation? What if Britain were to threaten that culture by taxing it illegally? How would Massachusetts people react to this? And you see that in the American Revolution, they react extremely violently. Where does the American Revolution start? It starts in Massachusetts. And go further. What if, when Massachusetts joins the United States, the people of Massachusetts and then the people of the North by proxy interpret the United States Constitution as divinely sanctioned, which they do. They refer to it as a miracle, divinely sanctioned miracle. What if something were to come along to threaten that Constitution by perhaps seceding from the Union, threatening to break apart that Constitution? How would that be interpreted, and what would the reaction be? And what if that same group of people was also violating God's laws by, say, murdering slaves or holding people in slavery? What would the reaction of the North be? And you see it very clearly in the Civil War when they sing songs about marching down to the South with God's wrath on their side. They equate any threats to God with the devil, and they go after the devil, trying to destroy the devil's minions. So we see this coming in the Civil War as well, this sense that we must destroy those who would destroy what God loves. Again, the thing is, though, when the colony isn't under a threat, or when it doesn't perceive a threat to what God loves, it's a very peaceful place. It's a loving, kind, school-interested, book-learning, weak-looking kind of place. And the North is the same way. If it's not perceiving a direct threat to what God loves, it tends to be pretty quiet and pretty book-learned and pretty weak-looking, and people underestimate what they're up against. They've been underestimating the North since the North first appeared. You see that underestimation in the 20th century as well. But again, remember, there's a line in Massachusetts society and in Northern society as well. Northern society as well. If you cross that line, this culture gets vicious very quickly. And the thing is, you have to remember, this culture isn't just going to stay in Massachusetts. It's going wherever Massachusetts descendants go. So where is that? Well, you can see it in this picture. This is the Old Ship Church in Hingham, Massachusetts, the oldest church in the United States that still operates today. Who went here? Well, an early ancestor of Abraham Lincoln's worshipped here. Out of the Puritan colonies come the settlers of Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, the people who are going to be the North in the Civil War.